if we have a inverse or not, so you see a lot of exam questions that ask you, does this have an inverse? Meaning, if y is equal to f of x, it just means your general function over here, and you have f of inverse x like this. Remember the context of, does this even exist? So simple question, if you have f of x equals to 2x squared, question might ask you, does this exist or not? You might be wondering what the fuck this even means, right? What it means is, just remember it this way, f of x to inverse f of x, it exists. This only exists, inverse f of x only exists if it's 1 to 1. Just memorize that. So the real question is if they ask you whether or not a function has an inverse. So when they ask you this question over here, does y is equal to 2x minus 3? F of x equals to 2x minus 3, for example. Does the inverse function exist? Obviously, this is the domain you have to incorporate with that. Does the inverse function exist? You just need to check, is it 1 to 1 or not? If it's 1 to 1, then yes, it does exist. If it's not 1 to 1, no, it doesn't exist. So just to tell if it's 1 to 1, how do you know if it's 1 to 1? Definition is just this. Take a look at this basic example. If you have y is equal to x plus 2, this is an example of a 1 to 1 function. It just means every single time you do this little dash, as in if this were 3, for example, dash, 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 how many y values do you read off of that? It's going to be 1 x value for 1 y value. And you can see how this definition fits, 1 to 1. Example of a many to 1 function, something like a parabola. Because look at this, every single time you do one dash over here, there's 2 dashes over here. As in one y value potentially has 2 possible x values. So this should be pretty clear to you now what the definition of 1 to 1 and many to 1 is. So for these questions over here, 2x minus 1, just say yes or no. Is it a 1 to 1 or a many to 1 function? 2x minus 3, pen and paper, write down. And tell me if this corresponds. Did you write down this is going to be a 1 to 1 function? Why is the 1 to 1 function? Because you can tell it's a straight line. For x is part of real numbers over here, it means x is allowed to be anything. This literally just means x is allowed to be any number over here. And if it's a straight line, I mean, come on, of course. Straight line just like this. 2x minus 3 is a straight line like this. That's 1 to 1. Obvious. This thing over here, this is a cubic. Cubic is going to be a graph that looks something like this. My point is that's also 1 to 1, right? You can tell when it reads off. So meaning this has a function inverse, this has an inverse function. 10 over x is going to be a hyperbola for x bigger than 0. Just check this out. 10 over x for x bigger than 0. If we were to plot this on the graph over here, just so you understand the concept, if you have y is equal to 10 over x, let's do this. Y is equal to 10 over x for x bigger than 0. Remember how you do with the domain over here? It just means what? X must be bigger than 0. Let's just take a look at it graphically. What happens here? What happens to this graph? See how this part originally doesn't exist anymore? Like, check this out. You just had the graph as is, look at the blue line. You know how there's 2 components? See these 2 curves? You see this? If you include this domain over here for x bigger than 0, you can tell why it's only going to be this line now. Yeah? And now my point is this 1 to 1? It's pretty obviously 1 to 1. No confusion? If you have the graph in front of you, it's pretty obvious, 1 to 1. One x value only has one y value over there. So therefore, part E, it is a 1 to 1 function. Therefore, an inverse function exists. Number G, y is equal to square root of x for x bigger than or equal to 10. Square root of x is just x to the power of halves. Oh, no confusion there. Now my point is, look at this. Is this 1 to 1? It's 1 to 1. Yeah? G is 1 to 1. X squared minus 3 for x part of real numbers. Do we need to plot the graph, or you can tell there's a parabola? Parabola is always going to be many to 1. It's not 1 to 1. But be careful over here, because check this out, okay? If you have x squared minus 3 over here, this obviously as is not 1 to 1. You can tell very obviously every single y value over here, like most of these y values, if you did y is equal to 5, you have 2 possible x values for that. That's not 1 to 1 for x. It's part of real numbers. But if you were to change the domain up a bit, do you see what happens when you do x bigger than 0? Did this turn into, from originally a non-1 to 1 into a 1 to 1 now? Do you see how this graph now is 1 to 1 after you apply a certain domain condition? This is going to be a very important relationship you use later on for exam questions. When you're interpreting exam questions, they're really testing on this relationship here. You'll need to use that. But for now, do you understand why if you have a parabola, as is for x squared minus 3, it's not going to be 1 to 1. But if you introduce a specific domain, it could be turned into a 1 to 1 function. Meaning, right now, inverse function doesn't exist. After you introduce a certain condition for the domain, inverse function does indeed exist. You'll see how this relates later on. 2 to the power of x for x bigger than 2 to the power of x. Let's just look at this. y is equal to 2 to the power of x. This is 1 to 1, yes or no? For the condition they give to you, for x bigger than or equal to 0, or excuse me, for x, for there's no condition, right? X allowed to be anything. Pretty obviously it's 1 to 1. This one over here, 3x squared plus 4, you can tell every single parabola as is not going to be 1 to 1, but you see this is an example we talked about before. For x bigger than or equal to 0, right now it's fucking not 1 to 1 at all. Like, look at this, right? Therefore the inverse function does not exist. But if you were to introduce a condition over here, it does exist now. So do you follow this now? Okay, just make sure when you look at exam questions later on, you're going to have this available to you. You just have the awareness that 1-to-1 functions is how you can tell whether or not an inverse exists. So when the question asks you for which the inverse exists, they're basically asking you, how do you make it into 1-to-1, if it's not already? Y squared equals to 4. You see where this is going. Y squared equals to 4x. I mean, look at this. Is this 1-to-1? No, it's not.